The Black Hills, Dakota Territory, August 1887. The decree was as hard and unyielding as the granite that gave the hills their bones. At 15 years of age, Ilara was an outcast, banished to the fringe of the settlement, given a shack that was little more than a collection of regrets held together by mud and wind. Her crime was not theft or violence, but a quietness that the loud, certain people of Providence Township found unsettling. She was accused of souring the milk of a neighbor's cow with a silent look, a charge born of superstition and a fear of anything that did not declare itself plainly. The truth was simpler and more damning. She was an orphan, a burden, and her presence was a constant, quiet reminder of the fragility that gnawed at them all. Her inheritance was this: a one-room cabin built by a prospector who had long since surrendered to the earth, a rusty wood stove with a cracked firebox, a threadbare blanket, and the memory of her father's voice. That voice, thick with the cadence of the Welsh valleys he'd left behind, was her only true possession. He had been a miner, a man who spoke of the earth not as a farmer did, a surface to be tilled, but as a living body with its own breath, its own deep warmth, and its own slow, powerful circulatory system of heat and water. "The ground is a miser, Ilara," he used to say, his hands tracing patterns in the dust. "It holds its riches tight, but it is an honest miser. What it takes, it will keep for you if you know how to ask." The cabin was a sieve for warmth. The summer sun baked it into a stifling box, and the autumn winds whistled through the chinking as if the walls were made of whispers. The floor was packed earth, cold even in August. The old-timers, men like Silas Blackwood, the township's most respected builder, knew what this meant. They had seen cabins like this become tombs. They spoke of the coming winter not by month, but by the number of cords of wood it would demand. For a sturdy, well-built home like Silas's, it was 10 cords. For Ilara's shack, it would be an impossible number. The cold would not simply enter her cabin. It would rise up from the ground itself, a relentless predator climbing through the soles of her feet. The floor would freeze solid by November, and no fire in that rusty stove could ever hope to push it back. She spent the last weeks of summer observing. She did not look at the trees to gauge the coming winter by the thickness of their bark as the others did. She watched the flow of things. She watched how the morning sun struck the eastern slope of the small rise behind her cabin. She watched how the cool air pooled in the low-lying hollows at dusk. She felt the ground with her bare hands, noting the composition of the soil, rich with clay, dense, a good holder of form and, as her father had taught her, a good holder of heat. She was not planning for a battle against the cold. The people of Providence believed you fought winter with fire, throwing log after log into a hungry stove that exhaled 90% of its gift straight up a chimney into the uncaring sky. Her father had called that paying the sky to stay warm. He considered it the highest form of foolishness. Her plan began to form, not as a blueprint, but as a memory. A memory of her father explaining the deep mines in Wales. "We did not fear the deep cold, girl," he'd told her. "We feared the deep heat, the earth's own furnace. The trick of a good mine is not just getting the coal out, but venting the heat, guiding the air. Air is a river. You just have to build the banks." One morning in early September, she began to dig. She did not dig a root cellar or a well. She started at the base of the chimney on the north side of her cabin and began to excavate a narrow trench, 2 feet wide and 4 feet deep. It was brutal, soul-crushing work for a girl of 15. The topsoil gave way to a dense, stubborn clay packed with stones that fought the shovel for every inch. Her hands, soft from a year of mending and kitchen work, were raw by noon on the first day. By the third day, they were a geography of blisters and blood. The men riding past on their way to the timber stands would slow their horses, watch her for a moment, and shake their heads. They saw a girl, grieving and lost, digging a meaningless ditch. A grave, perhaps. Some laughed. It was a nervous, unkind laughter. Her plan was to dig this trench around the entire perimeter of her small cabin, a perfect rectangle hugging the foundation. It was a monstrous undertaking, 40 feet of trench, 4 feet deep. It was a project for a team of strong men, not a slight girl with a broken shovel and a will forged in silence. Silas Blackwood stopped one afternoon. He was a man built of the same timber he used for his houses, solid, straight, and weathered. He was not an unkind man, but he was a man who believed in proven ways. He saw the world as a series of problems to be solved with an axe, a saw, and common sense. What Alara was doing defied all three. "Child," he said, his voice a low rumble of concern. He dismounted, his boots making no sound on the soft earth she had excavated. "What is this folly?" Alara paused, leaning on her shovel, her breath coming in ragged clouds in the cooling air. She looked at the trench, then at him. "It's a foundation," she said. Her voice was quiet, unused. Silas frowned, his brow furrowing. "A foundation? The cabin is already built, and you're digging where the walls already are. This makes no sense. You're undermining what little footing this shack has." He gestured with a thick finger. "Winter is coming. You should be chopping wood, not playing in the dirt. You'll need 20 cords to survive in this place. 20, and you have none." "I will need 5, she stated. It was not a boast or a guess. It was a calculation. The statement hung in the air between them. To Silas, it was the pronouncement of a madwoman. 5 cords of wood wouldn't last a sensible family through December. For this leaky shack to survive a Dakota winter on 5 cords was like expecting a candle to heat a barn. It was a death sentence. 5? He shook his head, a look of pity softening his stern features. "Alara, the community, they cast you out, but they don't want you to die. This is a waste of your strength. It's a waste of the precious time you have left before the first freeze." He saw her not as an innovator, but as a liability, a tragedy waiting to happen on the township's doorstep. She looked down at the dark, damp clay clinging to her shovel. She remembered her father's words about smoke. "Smoke is a thief, Alara. It steals the best part of the fire and runs away up the chimney. A smart man makes the thief pay rent before it leaves." She looked back at Silas, her eyes clear and steady. "A drain can also be a source," she said. The cryptic phrase sealed his opinion. He saw her now as lost to reason, her grief having broken something essential inside her. He climbed back onto his horse, the leather creaking in protest. "The first blizzard will be the end of this foolishness," he said, more to himself than to her. "And the end of you if you don't stop." He rode away, leaving her alone with the growing shadow of the hills and the monumental task ahead. He was not wrong to be concerned. By every known principle of construction and survival on the prairie, Alara was digging her own grave. He was not wrong. He was just ignorant of other principles. The story of Alara's folly spread through the township. It became a cautionary tale, a piece of local folklore before the first snowflake had even fallen. The girl who answered her coming death by digging a moat around her house. It was absurd. It was tragic. And for Alara, it was a shield. Their mockery gave her the one thing she craved: solitude. They left her alone to her madness and her work. Through September and into the biting cold of October, she dug. She lined the bottom of the trench with flat stones she hauled from a nearby creek bed, creating a smooth, stable channel. Then, she began lining the sides. This was the most difficult part. She needed to create a long, sealed tube of stone, a flue, that would snake its way around her entire cabin, buried 4 feet underground. She used a mixture of clay and sand as a crude but effective mortar, fitting the stones together with a patience born of absolute necessity. It was like building a horizontal chimney, a great, square serpent swallowing its own tail. Her body ached with a fire that never went out. Her muscles screamed, but with every stone she placed, she felt not despair, but a growing sense of rightness. This was her father's knowledge, made real. She was not just building a structure. She was building a relationship with the earth beneath her feet. She was asking it to become her partner in survival. The action of the narrative must now pause, for the principle at work here is too important to be left to implication. It must be laid bare. The people of Providence, like most people of their time, understood heat in only one way: direct radiation. You stood in front of a fire, and you were warm. You moved away, and you were cold. The fire was the source, the air was the medium, and distance was the enemy. Their entire architecture was based on this flawed, wasteful premise. The fireplace, a symbol of hearth and home, was in reality a fantastically inefficient machine for heating the sky. It drew vast amounts of cold air into the house to feed its draft, chilling every corner of the room except the small semicircle before its mouth. It was a thermal tyrant, demanding constant tribute in the form of firewood, only to send the bulk of its power, the hot gases, the smoke, scurrying away into the atmosphere as fast as possible. Ilara was building a system based on a different, far more powerful principle: thermal mass. Thermal mass is the ability of a material to absorb, store, and later release heat. A log cabin has very little thermal mass. Wood is a good insulator, but it cannot store significant heat. Once the fire goes out, the cabin gets cold quickly. Stone, water, and dense earth, however, are phenomenal thermal batteries. They absorb heat slowly, and they release it slowly and evenly over a long period. A sun-baked rock remains warm long after sunset. This was the principle Ilara was harnessing. Her system was an elegant, brutal feat of engineering. She dismantled the bottom of the existing short chimney. In its place, she connected the stovepipe not to the sky, but to the earth. She directed it downward, into the stone-lined tunnel she had built. Now, when she lit a fire, the hot smoke and exhaust gases could not escape directly. They were forced on a long, 40-foot journey through the subterranean stone flue that encircled her home before they were finally allowed to exit through a new, taller chimney she constructed at the far end of the loop. This was the genius of it. This was making the smoke pay rent. As the hot gases, with temperatures exceeding 500 degrees Fahrenheit, traveled through the stone channel, the stones would act like a sponge, absorbing the heat. The transfer was not instantaneous. It was a slow, steady soaking. The stones would heat up, and they, in turn, would pass that heat into the dense, clay-rich earth surrounding the trench. She was not heating her cabin. She was heating the very ground upon which it sat. She was creating a massive, slow-release thermal battery of stone and earth, a heated foundation that would store the energy from a few hours of a hot fire and radiate it gently and consistently for a day or more. She had, in effect, created a low-tech, high-efficiency heat exchanger. The smoke, by the time it completed its 40-foot journey and exited the new chimney, would be cool to the touch, stripped of almost all its thermal energy. All that precious heat which in Silas Blackwood's cabin was being shot into the sky, was now stored in the hundreds of tons of earth beneath and around her floor. The floor of her cabin would no longer be a source of cold, a frozen plain stealing warmth from her body. It would become a source of heat, a massive, gentle, radiant panel. By the first week of November, it was done. She had moved thousands of pounds of earth and stone. She filled the trench back in, burying her work completely. To an observer, it looked as if nothing had changed, save for a new chimney stack on the opposite side of the cabin. The ground around her home looked scarred, but the great folly, the trench itself, had vanished. The first snows came, dusting the hills in a thin blanket of white. The air grew teeth. The people of Providence huddled closer to their stoves, feeding the beast, watching their wood piles shrink with alarming speed. Ilara lit her first fire. She kept it small, just enough to warm the stove, but she ran it for 12 hours straight. She was not trying to heat the air in the room. She was making her first deposit into her thermal bank. For the next week, she ran a hot fire for a few hours each morning and a few hours each evening. The air in the cabin remained chilly. An outsider would have deemed the experiment a failure. But Ilara was not measuring the air. She would lie on the packed earth floor, her hands spread flat against the ground. On the third day, she felt it. Not warmth, but the absence of deep cold. By the fifth day, a faint, persistent hint of warmth was detectable. By the seventh day, the floor of her cabin was detectably, miraculously, warm to the touch. The cold was no longer rising from the ground. The ground was now her ally. The earth itself had become her hearth. December arrived with a vengeance, a month of iron skies and relentless, scraping wind. The temperature hovered near zero for weeks. In the township, the rhythm of life became the rhythm of the axe and the stove door. Wood piles dwindled. The cold was a physical presence in every home, lurking in the corners, creeping across the floors, turning spilled water into a sheet of ice in minutes. Silas Blackwood, in his well-built house, was already burning through his wood faster than he'd anticipated. The floors of his home, made of thick sawn pine planks set on stone piers, were painfully cold. The air a foot above the floor was a reservoir of icy misery. His family lived in a small bubble of warmth around their cast-iron stove, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Ilara, in her crumbling shack, lived in a different reality. The air in her cabin was not hot, but it was a stable, comfortable 55 degrees. The key was the floor. It radiated a gentle, constant warmth that heated the entire space evenly from the ground up. There were no cold spots. There were no drafts. She burned a fraction of the wood the others did, running a small, hot fire for just 2 hours in the morning and 2 in the evening to keep her thermal battery charged. Her 5 cords of wood, stacked neatly against the south wall, looked almost untouched. She was not just surviving, she was comfortable. The whispers in the township changed. The laughter had long since died, replaced by a confused and suspicious curiosity. Her chimney produced so little smoke. She was never seen chopping wood. How was she alive? Rumors, darker than the ones that had led to her banishment, began to circulate. Witchcraft. A pact with some dark spirit of the earth. It was easier to believe in the supernatural than to believe that their own time-honored knowledge was fundamentally flawed. Then came January 12th, 1888. History would remember it as the school children's blizzard. It arrived without warning. The morning was unseasonably mild, a deceptive thaw that lured people out of their homes without their heavy coats. Then, in an instant, the sky dropped like a wall of white. A hurricane of snow and ice, propelled by winds of 60 miles per hour, descended upon the plains. The temperature plummeted from a mild 30 degrees above zero to 20 below, and then 40 below in a matter of hours. It was a storm of unprecedented, murderous fury. For the people of Providence, it was the ultimate test. It was a test their methods would fail. Inside Silas Blackwood's home, the world had shrunk to the space around the roaring stove. He fed it constantly, piece after piece of seasoned oak, but the fire seemed to have no effect. The wind drove the cold through the walls, through the window frames, through the floorboards. The temperature inside the house, more than 10 feet from the stove, was below freezing. The water in the barrel was a solid block of ice. His wife and 2 small children were huddled under a mountain of quilts, their breath pluming in the air. Silas felt a cold he had never known, a deep, invasive cold that seemed to be freezing his very bones. But worse than the cold was the fear. He looked at his woodpile inside the house. It was almost gone. The main pile outside was buried under 10 feet of snow. When the wood ran out, they would last hours, not days. His house, his pride, the symbol of his expertise and his standing in the community, had become a trap. Its inefficiency was a death sentence. In that moment of terror, with the wind shrieking like a banshee outside, he thought of the quiet, mad girl in the prospector's shack. He thought of her impossible claim. "I will need 5. He thought of her strange, nonsensical words. "A drain can also be a source." It was madness. It had to be. But his own sanity, his own common sense, was failing him, failing his family. Desperation is a key that unlocks doors you never knew existed. He had to know. He had to see. Pulling on every layer he owned, wrapping his face until only his eyes were exposed, he told his wife he was going for the woodpile. It was a lie. He opened the door and was thrown back by the force of the wind. He crawled out into the white chaos, a world without direction, without substance. The journey was only 200 yards, but it was a polar expedition. The wind tore at him, the snow blinding him, the cold a physical, crushing weight. He navigated by memory, by the ghost of a fence line, by sheer, desperate will. When he finally stumbled against the wall of Alara's cabin, he was half frozen, his beard a mask of ice. He saw no light from the window, which was caked with snow. He heard nothing but the howl of the storm. For a moment, he was certain he had come all this way only to find her frozen body. He hammered on the door with a numb fist. The door opened. Alara stood there, holding a small oil lamp. She was wearing a simple wool dress. She was not wrapped in blankets. She was not shivering. Behind her, the lamplight cast a calm, steady glow. There was no roaring fire in the stove. In fact, the stove door was closed, and only a faint warmth emanated from it. He stumbled inside, falling to his knees, bringing a gale of snow and wind with him. She shut the door, sealing out the storm. And then he felt it. It was not the blast of heat from a fire. It was a profound, pervasive, and utterly impossible warmth. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere. The air was not hot, but it was gentle. He pulled off his gloves, his fingers stiff and clumsy. He placed his bare hand on the packed earth floor. It was warm. It was not just not frozen. It was distinctly, undeniably warm as a living thing. He pressed his palm flat, trying to comprehend the sensation. He looked around the small, calm space. A pot of something simmered on the back of the stove, filling the air with the scent of herbs. A book lay open on a small table. There was no sense of crisis. There was no battle for survival. There was only peace. He looked up at Alara, his eyes wide with a dawning, shattering understanding. All his knowledge, all his experience, all the rules by which he had lived and built and judged had just been proven utterly, catastrophically wrong. He, the master builder, was freezing to death in his superior home. This child, this outcast, was living in quiet comfort in a hovel. He did not have the words. He did not need them. He simply looked at her, and his entire world of certainty collapsed into a single, humble question that was visible in his eyes. How? Alara looked at the powerful man, now broken and kneeling on her floor. She saw no triumph in his defeat. She saw only a man who was cold and afraid for his family. She went to a small chest and took out her last spare blanket, a thick Welsh wool her mother had woven. She draped it over his shoulders. "The earth," she said, her voice soft. "The earth is the hearth. The fire is just the match." She gave him a hot cup of broth. As he drank, the warmth spreading through his chest, she explained. She did not use technical terms. She spoke of the smoke as a river of warmth. She spoke of the stone channel as the river's banks. She spoke of the ground as a great, slow pot of stew which, once heated, stays warm for a very long time. She made it simple. She made it sound like the most obvious thing in the world. And now, for Silas, it was. He saw the elegant, undeniable truth of it. He had been fighting the cold. She had been inviting the warmth. He had been trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it. She had turned the bucket itself into the source. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, a stunned and grieving territory emerged from the snow. Lives had been lost. Livestock was decimated. Homes had failed. But from the fringe of Providence Township, a new story began to spread. It was the story of Silas Blackwood and his family, who had survived the blizzard's worst night, huddled not in their own fine house, but in Alara's tiny, warm cabin. Silas Blackwood became Alara's first student. He did not ask her to build for others. He asked her to teach him the principles. He brought his pride, laid it at her feet, and asked her to replace it with knowledge. That spring, he did not build houses. He dug trenches. He and his crew, under the quiet guidance of a 16-year-old girl, retrofitted the foundations of half the homes in Providence, including his own. They called it the Welsh Trench at first, and then, simply, Alara's Hearth. She never lorded her knowledge over them. She shared it freely, as her father had shared it with her. She taught them how to read the soil, how to select the right stones, how to mortar with clay. She taught them that the goal was not a hotter fire, but a smarter path for its heat. She transformed from the town's liability to its most valuable asset. She was no longer the strange, silent girl. She was the woman who understood the earth's breath. Alara lived a long life in the Black Hills. She never moved from her small cabin, though the town offered to build her a grander one. She had everything she needed. She had her warmth, her quiet, and the deep, abiding respect of the community that had once cast her out. The houses in that region began to look different. They were built with an understanding of the ground beneath them. They were built for partnership with nature, not for combat. The principle of her buried flue, of the thermal battery, became a piece of regional folk wisdom, its origins in Welsh mining and a young girl's resilience eventually forgotten by many, but its effectiveness never was. The legacy of her work is a quiet one. It is not a monument of stone or brass. It is the simple, profound absence of a frozen floor. It is the story of how an outcast, armed with nothing but forgotten knowledge and a stubborn will, taught a whole community the most important lesson of survival. The most powerful solutions are often not about adding more force, but about understanding the existing flow. Fire is not the gift. Heat is the gift. And the greatest waste is to let a gift escape before it has done its work. Her father had taught her to make the smoke pay rent. She in turn taught others that the earth, if you ask it properly, will not only give you shelter, but will hold you in its warm and steady hand. What about you? What forgotten wisdom lies buried in your own memory, passed down from a grandparent or an old mentor? What seemingly foolish trench are you being called to dig, while the world of conventional wisdom shakes its head and tells you to chop more wood? Your ground is waiting to become your hearth. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters are fictional, and the events are a dramatization of principles. The content does not constitute professional engineering or architectural advice. It is a story about resilience, ingenuity, and the power of looking at a problem from a completely different angle.